disposal prohibition in 2019 as part of the policy package to reduce impacts of climate change by maximizing business food waste recovery. The resolution directed staff to develop Metro code and administrative rule language to prohibit the disposal of commercial food waste within the Metro region with an effective date of January 2025. The intent of the prohibition was to really, as I said, provide that hard backstop to the requirement for businesses to participate in the program and maximize recovery. Today, we'd like to we're seeking direction to extend the effective date of that prohibition from 2025 to 2027. And this will allow us to do two things. First one, it'll allow continued implementation of the food waste requirement. And the second, it gives us time for the needed stakeholder engagement and regional coordination to develop the code and rule language for Metro Council consideration. We also received this feedback from the Business Food Scraps Roundtable, which supported the extension to allow that time for coordination. Next slide, please. So our policy options are one, to direct staff to continue with the landfill disposal prohibition with the date of January 1st, 2025. And the second is to direct staff to extend the deadline to January 1st, 2027. Next slide, please. The staff recommendation is the council extend the effective date to January 2027. And with that, next slide, final slide. I'd just like to end the presentation with this question and then open it up for discussion.
Okay, that's a lot of squash. Can we go back 2 slides? And watermelons, like, sorry.
the slide 19 with the policy options.
One more.
There you
go. What's the difference between 1 and 2?
It's the date. We're just asking to extend the effective date. So continue with the landfill disposal prohibition, but rather than have the effective date be this January, essentially, we're asking for that 2-year extension to 2027. So we have that time to work with our stakeholders to develop code and rule for council consideration.
So the first one is to just continue.
Yeah.
And the second is the extension.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
Just different way to look at it. All right, moving, can you go back to the, yep, there we go. All right, sorry was there anything else you wanted to say before?
Nope.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. It was appreciated to go all the way back to the beginning and kind of come forward of where we are and why we're doing this. Council, any questions for staff on that presentation? Clarifications?
Just,
yeah, Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Just quickly, so this will be helpful for staff. It will also obviously be helpful for businesses. What are we getting from them for giving them this extension?
That's
more complete or more comprehensive inclusion of products, more education to their customers. What are they doing to avoid this?
Yeah, it's allowed, since we're at 44% participation rate. So it's allowing us to continue with the implementation and allowing local governments to continue working with businesses to get them on board.
So are we doing anything to thank the folks, the 44% who managed to think we were serious?
We don't have any recognition programs in place to kind of recognize the existing compliance, but that's certainly a conversation that we could have with local governments. I think the extension provides us the opportunity to continue to work in collaboration with them, understanding the constraints that I think Dina mentioned in her presentation that a number of businesses are facing in the current climate, and being able to have more time to work in partnership to bring them into compliance, because we are asking them to change some of their operations with separating.
And I understand
food waste. Yeah.
The point of my questioning is really to get to whether we're conscious and being careful about not sending a message that when we set a deadline and you whine to us or give us legitimate reasons for not meeting it either way, that we're not just gonna roll over and say, oh, okay, because it gives a disincentive to the folks who are holding up their end of the deal.
Appreciate that feedback.
I would, just one thing to say. So there is a waiver, that's an annual waiver if a business does have some issues with not being able to comply, and it is laid out in the policy. And there are certification programs within some of the cities and counties that recognize the green or sustainable efforts that do include having compost and donation programs as well as prevention actions within their daily operations. So it's not a region-wide thing, but it's a good suggestion of just acknowledging those businesses.
If you keep saying you gotta do it by here, and then we say, oh, well, we're gonna push it back a year, we're gonna push it back 6 months, we're gonna push it back 2 years. Quick factual question, you mentioned that 44% have complied. Is that 44% of the number of entities, or is it 44% of the total volume?
It's businesses.
Do we know how much volume it represents?
We can figure that out. It's so the largest, so group one are the largest businesses at 1,000 pounds or more a week. And we have nearly 100% compliance there. And
Great.
yeah, and then the next is 500. So we are.
And does it go down from that, or is it
Yes.
just the two?
Yeah, it goes down from that. And then the third group, which is the one that has the lowest compliance rate, is just 250 pounds a week. So I'd say we're, for our capture, the amount that we're capturing, we're definitely over 50 to 60% of what our goal is.
So I'm fine with this recommendation, this request. I'd encourage you to look at that data by size and therefore by volume. Because from a climate and environmental perspective, you're right. Getting the big players to comply gets the most stuff out of the stream. And if it might inform you in how you engage with the non-complying 56%, that would be smart. You're already focusing on the top, and that's great.
Thank you. Councilor Wong, Rosenthal, Gonzalez, and Lewis.
Great. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for your engagement on this process. I have a clarifying question and then just kind of a policy question. On the 250 pounds of food waste and kind of all those different levels, how is the, I guess, weighing done? Is it like self-report, or like do people bring it somewhere?
I'm gonna get a little
Yeah.
bit geeky with you.
Yeah.
When we planned the program, we knew all the businesses that were gonna be subject to the requirement. And then we estimated how much they would produce based on different data. And that allowed us to put them into groups. And so for the business, essentially, it's by container. So we talk about large generators being 4 60-gallon roll carts or more a week, the mid-size at 500 pounds being 2 60-gallon roll carts, and the small ones being 1 60-gallon roll cart, which is about 250 pounds. It's at the high side. It's that. So for the business, it's the generation that they see based on service level.
Got it. That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
And just on the policy question, can you maybe help explain why the 2 years is kind of the staff recommendation and it isn't more, because I think we're all feeling some urgency around climate change and the goals that we all set. And why isn't that 1 year and setting benchmarks, and if another year is needed, we can come back next year. But yeah, like what are the benefits and trade-offs of, the 2 year versus 1 year?
It was based on the original timing for the program. The original program, the generator requirement was to come into place. And then 2 years later, the prohibition was to come in place. Because the generator requirement was delayed 2 years, we're now proposing to delay the prohibition by 2 years. So it's really an alignment issue. That was the original phasing, but because of COVID, we did not implement the requirement on the original timeline. So we're doing kind of a reset, if you will. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and what are it's still, time has still passed and we've still been working on it. So what are the benefits of a full reset rather than an accelerated timeline based on what we know now?
It's not a full reset because the requirement has come into play. And as we shared sort of where we're at with the compliance, it's giving that same amount of time as was in the original design for the program before we put the prohibition into place. And in part, Holly highlighted some of the benefits of that is the opportunity to collaborate with both industry and local government partners on the development of that prohibition before we bring that to council, which was part of the original program design as well.
Is at this point with the 2025 date, like it's November 2024. If we were to bring code and rule to you with an effective date of 2025, we wouldn't have time to work with our partners to develop that code and rule. I really hear what you're saying on climate change, and should we look at giving it a year and coming back to 2026? So it's one, as Marta said, it was the alignment with the original timing, but if there's urgency, we would ask at least to have that year to work with our partners to develop that code and rule to bring it to you for consideration. So that's, and that is one of the things we heard at the business roundtable was really that desire to collaborate regionally to develop code and rule before bringing it to council. So.
Madam President, maybe for a future work session, if maybe the staff could come back with some milestones to hit for the next, upcoming period of time. Like, I don't want us to be in a position of extending it again because we didn't reach milestones. And if we're more, up to date on what we hope to accomplish in the next 2 years so that we can launch or have the, the effective date be the effective date, I think that would be really helpful and from an oversight perspective.
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Good suggestion. Councilor Rosenthal, Gonzalez, and Lewis.
You're muted.
Councilor, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. The cursor had moved. First of all, I'm impressed that we've come to 90+% on the large distributors. And I'm also very encouraged that the two of the waste haulers in my district have food scrap recycling programs. They have extra space and they've been somewhat proactive. My questions are, I have two questions. One is, have we identified, as you noted, we have some gaps on the east side where we don't have we identified any potential public-private partnerships where we could put sites? And then related to that, how many food or plastic or packaging removal systems do you think we need regionally to make this totally effective? If we have only one, I've heard discussions of 2 or 3. So where do we go with that?
That's a great question, Councilor Rosenthal. And the vision for that is within the system facilities plan and the organics chapter that articulates Metro Central, which currently manages approximately 70% of the region's food waste through the transfer station. And in addition to that, developing additional hubs. And in the system facilities plan, you can see the draft concept of where those hubs would be located geographically. So part of the implementation of that plan would be seeking those public-private partnerships for those additional hubs. In terms of depackagers, we currently have the investment at Metro Central, which I think to Councilor Wong, perhaps that could serve as a milestone that staff could include in coming back to council in addition to other ones. That is currently a proposed investment. We did get some feedback in the draft comment period in the system facilities plan about potentially having just one depackager in the region. I think that's something that will require further discussion as a part of the implementation of that strategy, because there are also other types of depackagers out there, such as dry waste depackagers that might be suitable for something different than, such as animal feed, that would be different than the depackager going into Metro Central. So I think that's discussions to come. We have a vision and strategy, but part of the implementation will be those conversations to define what those public-private partnerships look like and the detail of those investments.
Just a quick follow-up. So Pride and Republic don't do any depackaging of the food waste they get?
No, they transfer the material. And it's my understanding that Pride currently, although it's authorized to do that, doesn't currently transfer. They send their material to WRI. So currently we just have 2 functioning facilities that are doing that transfer.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Counselor Gonzalez and then Counselor Lewis.
Thanks, President Peterson. Always happy to see the WPAS team come present to us and share progress on regional waste plan projects and things like that. I am in support of the delay for a few different reasons. I think a lot of the assumptions that we made in the initial timeline when we rolled it out didn't account for the pandemic. And I mean, I'm even thinking about where we were 2-3 years ago when we were all trying to come together to find ways to keep our restaurants alive and to, cut through the bureaucratic red tape for, outdoor eating, or we were, that was not so long ago in terms of where I think we were. And I think to me, I'm approaching that from that lens that we've made significant progress, but also need to recognize that we need to have a little bit of flexibility as this industry gets back on its feet. With cost of living pressures, I just think it's being responsible in responding to that. I did have a question that Councillor Nolan asked, which was around the total volume of the system or what we forecast, because I saw that we shared some numbers around overall compliance, but that was more so of the individual businesses, but not so much how much we think our region is producing. So just to be clear, we don't have that number right now, or if we do, it's not super off the top of
We can get back to you with some of the, a little bit more analysis, but right now in the region, we're somewhere around 21,000 tons a year that we're capturing. The original goal was to capture 50,000 tons. But again, kind of with the analysis and COVID and what we're seeing, we may be reducing that goal down to more like 35 or 40,000 tons, which is our goal. So we're on our way, but we can do some more analysis and kind of get back to you on what I can tell you where we're at today, but then look at those businesses that aren't in compliance yet. And we can kind of estimate of this is how much more we think is out there. And also DEQ just finished their waste composition study that shows us how much food is in the waste stream. So we're right at the beginning of looking at a number of different data sets to kind of true up our numbers and really kind of understand that.
Yeah, and I think I also overheard you mention that it was around, we think it's close to 50 to 60% of what we think the region is already. More or less, we're kind of, we've gotten over that hump. So I know it's very a gut check of what we might think is out there. So, okay. My next question, and I tried to go through the slides again and in the report that you shared with us before I asked, but in terms of the prohibition, that connotes obviously compliance or not compliance. And so when people don't comply, what are the consequences? What are the fees? If I missed that somewhere, I'm sorry, but what is the penalty?
So look, as part of the policy or the requirement is to require local governments to adopt ordinances to require businesses So implementation and enforcement actually sits at the local government level. So every one of our local governments has an enforcement strategy in their ordinance. And it generally starts with, and and Dina may be able to tell, have some specific stories, but it generally starts with, you're out of compliance, we're gonna send you a letter, then somebody's gonna come and help, like, do some technical assistance. And then if you're still not in compliance, many of the local governments then step through fines, actually finding businesses.
Yeah, so as a part of our kind of regional program, do we have a regional set of kind of general standards, or is it completely delegated to our local partners? I mean, I'm just thinking, let's say I have a restaurant, one in each county or one in 5 cities. Being out of compliance means I might get fined twice as much somewhere else, or it just depends on where I'm registered.
Yes, it's at the city and county level,
Okay,
what their compliance code chapter says.
okay. And my last question, does this apply to sticks and bricks only, or is it like thinking about food carts or like food stands and things like that? I mean, if you can remind me, it's been so long since I
Yeah.
really dug into it.
It applies to anybody who generates more than 250 pounds a week. The individual business is how it's written. So, and that goes for like a strip mall of, if a business is located in a strip mall that's a food generating business, if that business produces more than 1 roll cart a week, it must comply with the requirement, and that the manager of the property manager must make sure that they have service available. For the food carts, because you have all those individual businesses, the individual business at the food cart is generally doesn't produce enough to be subject to the requirement. And part of the reason for that was that enforcement, like, who do you
Yeah, of
go
course.
back to? You go back to the generator, rather than the cart pod owner to try to get. But a number of cart pods do have food scraps. And also the requirement is back of house. So it's just what the food that's in control of the employee, rather than that again, with the food cart, it's like that front of house. And there are reasons we didn't require front of house, which I'm happy to
Yeah,
explain as
no,
well.
that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
And the 250 is starting to ring a bell again.
Yeah.
I guess like my last question is more so like a desire to hear more from y'all about your approach to narrative and storytelling as we continue to, thank the businesses that have, done the extra work to get there, but also selling this to continue to sell this as the vision to the region and to people that live in the region, and not taking for granted that, we value these things and support them. Obviously there's like new rules like this can increase costs, and so there's like, we're buying something, and we're buying diversion, we're buying lowering our carbon footprint, and so I think it'll be important to do that. Through the reports I read, we've been able to divert 46,000 tons of food since the start of the program. 550 metric tons of methane have been diverted from the landfills, which is, conservatively 4 times more impactful than carbon on dioxide. So 2,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide essentially divert. Why is that important? Right? Like, what are we doing to show the progress that we're making? Because that feels really significant. And I think it's something that as a council too, we should be owning those victories as well alongside you, and not just like the regulatory hurdles and the delays and things like that. So just thinking about the North Star kind of
I love that.
conversation that we've been having for this year, and how we get to kind of piece some of those things and weave them together. So if anything that you can do to keep doing that through WPES would be greatly appreciated.
I would like to point out that Food Waste Stops With Me is a hub for those. local success stories. And we have them in video as well as 1 or 2 page success stories that outline local businesses who have taken the time to adopt particular efforts. And so it's a good business to business sort of proof of concept. And is what we use in our communications plan, where there's that aligned messaging with local governments. So we're lifting up those stories to tell and to show, another business that may be reticent, oh, we can't do this, it's too hard, it's too costly, that they can find a like business that has done it. And so it's not just us government wonks telling them that they should do it. It's like, hey, look, your peer is doing it. So
In addition to that, I just really appreciate that feedback, because I think there is an opportunity and goals that we've set for WPES to increase the storytelling around regional investments to solid waste fees. So I think this is a great component for us to lift up the benefits that are related to these investments that we're making as a region.
Yeah, and I know our local jurisdictional partners are making big investments in education and incentive programs. I've seen it. Actually, I have one more question. So depending on the tier of like the large, medium, small, I'm thinking back about the tour that a lot of us were able to do this summer at Metro Central, going to food waste. And I know every now and then we all go to different transfer station or MRFs and things like that to look at stuff. But do we have a sense of like what the kind of contamination rate between each of the tiers is? I'm thinking through, again, the lens of education and like what goes where, what doesn't go where. Going back to other conversations we've had about major pilots happening in the region, won't name names, where we're putting, air quotes, compostable things and that don't actually go there. So I'm wondering, what is that education like? What is actually the success of the contamination, and are we tracking that? And that'll be my last question. Thanks, President Peterson.
We did do a waste composition study before the program started to determine the contamination rate. Because prior to the requirement going into effect, we had a voluntary program that had been in place for quite a while. So these were businesses that were voluntarily participating and knew it was food waste only. At that point, the contamination rate total was 6% by weight. And that total includes something that we allow, which are the compostable can liners. We allow compostable can liners for businesses for health code reasons, to keep the containers clean. It's a little bit of a complicated issue, but our processors view those as contaminants. And that's one of the things we're working on pulling out for a number of reasons. So that 6% includes those can liners by weight, and by volume, because plastic is light, it's about 11%. We know the contamination rate is higher now because as businesses are coming on in a non-voluntary fashion, right? They're bringing in more contamination. But once we get the depackager, we will start to measure. We'll be measuring that amount of contamination that's coming off. We'll need to do that if we get the EPA grant funding.
Sweet, thanks. Yeah. Hopefully technology helps us facilitate it all better.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. Really appreciate this work. I thank Councilor Gonzalez for bringing us up 3 levels, because when we think about the biggest places we can make impact on climate change, yes, there's built environment and transportation, but then right under that is food. And so the work not only of the waste system, but also on overproduction of certain crops, on waste in our daily habits, all of it fits together on kind of the third plank of the biggest sustainability impacts we can make. So I'd really like to see us bring in that front end savings as well. Want to lift up the comments from Councilor Wong around benchmark or an intermediate check-in point, because I do see the need for us to move back to 27, but I don't want us to hit that date and have any falters. I want us to actually stick the landing on January 1 or January 2nd, whatever that date is. So I would support moving the date, but with an intermediate check-in, maybe with some incentives. Come back to us at budget time if we need to build in those incentives. I have 2 questions. Obviously, from a regulatory perspective, our jurisdiction is in Oregon, but from a resource perspective, Washington may have something to offer. What kind of systems mapping are we doing with Washington? What do we look at with the footprint of particularly like Clark County for resources in this area?
In terms of opportunities for additional end markets or processing?
And markets, processing, in potential investments that could be made in the region, but maybe not within our immediate sightline.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the conversation and as a part of the implementation strategy. I think Holly noted at the beginning of the presentation, the desire to have diverse and redundant markets. So that is something that we know that there are opportunities in Washington with other anaerobic digestion facilities being built. Can be a part of our system as well to help create that diversity of markets. So that's definitely will continue to be a part of our strategy for implementation.
Okay. I guess with that, I would just love to hear more about how at the very political level we can help with those engagements. We obviously do it all the time for things like bridges.
Appreciate that.
Then on the thread that we were just talking about, in terms of what we define commercial as, we seem to really define it as the commercial kitchen, not a commercial venue in which food is produced. I have the opportunity to work with a lot of schools and how schools are structured nowadays. A lot of times they don't actually use their commercial kitchens and the food gets brought in. I would be intrigued by what we could do about further policy development for large production consumer end venues like that. I know it would be a new tier. But on this kind of supply demand kind of question, we're talking about the demand today. So there is that demand. What can we do to meet it? Have you given that any thought?
Specific to schools, and I can let Dina speak to this, there is a lot of work because there's a lot of like when we think about our business, like schools are in the third tier of the program because they, share commonalities. And yeah, most of the food that comes in is in that commercial kitchen when we're talking back of house. But in schools, elementary school, high school, a lot of that food waste is produced in that cafeteria. One of the reasons we didn't include that was an equity reason why we didn't include that in the requirement is because many of those programs are run by volunteers, parents, volunteer organizations that come in and help set up those front of house programs. And so at the time, we didn't want to burden schools with that. However, there's a lot of work done with that and our local government partners. And I'll turn it over to Dina to talk about that because that is a focus.
So the staff that I work with engages businesses or, food generating businesses. But then other staff is more residentially faced. And so there's a lot of work happening there. With us, the education and youth leadership team under CSE is doing a lot of work and a lot of audits with schools because they understand that, again, like Holly said, the food waste is really being generated in front of the house. So there's quite a bit of work happening there. Really with the staff that I work with, local outreach, we see more engagement and standard operating procedures that can be adopted in more university settings. But yeah, definitely in the elementary, middle school, and high school, the focus needs to be on front of the house, and there is good work happening there with the education and youth leadership team.
Great, thank you. I just think that education only goes so far if you don't actually have that bin that's actually going to go to the place it needs to go, right? And so I've talked to multiple school administrators who feel like they don't have the ability to opt in. So we can talk more specifically offline, but I would like for us to have more concrete material developed specifically for schools. Even just more clear language about when they're included and when they're not in requirements versus what their kind of optional opportunities are.
I ran into Jamie Rapaski and she was actually laminating some signage and materials for schools and talking about having refrigerators for excess food that can be
Oh my
picked up
gosh,
by a
how
donation-
great.
donation partner. So it's happening.
Okay.
But you know, it's always, we can always improve and
It's a
Thank
great
you.
suggestion. Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, I'm hearing from the council that we'd like to see that resolution come before us for the extension. And I don't see anybody shaking their head no. So we'll get that on the calendar and thank you for continuing to move forward. I guess the second part is just the follow-up with milestones and getting to the deadline. And however we can help with that as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the time today.
Thanks for all your work.
Appreciate it.
All right, we'll move on to our next council agenda item, which is our state legislative agenda. We have Annalisa Curler here to give us an update. Council, we've had several opportunities to weigh in on this, and Annalisa's here just to reconfirm before we adopt, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Metro Council President. Good morning, councilors. My name is Annalisa Curler. I am your Legislative Affairs Manager, and I use she, her pronouns. And like Council President said, I am here today to talk about your legislative agenda. This is the third time that I am before you and the final time before you are slated for adoption on December 19th. Next slide, please. So to kick off today's presentation, I'm going to do a 2024 election recap. And then we're going to talk about your legislative principles and your legislative priorities. Next slide. So before I dive into the 2024 election results, I want to be clear that these results that I'm going to be talking about are very much focused on the state level, since this is your state legislative agenda. We will have some more information coming to you about the impacts of the federal election. You guys are slated to adopt your federal agenda in the early winter. And so as a part of those conversations, there will be some more information about the impacts of the 2024 election at the federal level on Metro, on our region, and those types of things. Next slide. So just to start at the top of the ticket, from a statewide race perspective, we had 3 statewide races that were on the ballot. That was our Secretary of State, our Treasurer, and our Attorney General. The Democrats maintained their hold on all 3 of these statewide seats. A couple things to note is that Oregon did elect its first female treasurer, and Elizabeth Steiner. Females have held other seats, the other 4 statewide seats, but this is the first time that Oregon has seen a female treasurer. And then just to highlight that 4 of the 5 statewide offices are also held by Portland metro area individuals. Although to be clear, the governor has moved officially to Salem, so I'm not sure if she would call herself a Portland metro area individual, but she did indeed live here for a very long time. Next slide. From the legislative perspective, one significant change was that the Democrats now have a supermajority in the Senate. They flipped a Central Oregon seat. That was the only seat that flipped. And the Democrats have maintained their majority in the House. To be clear, there's still a few races that are yet to be called on the House side, but it is looking very much like the numbers are going to remain the same between Republicans and Democrats in the House. Next slide for me. There were quite a few statewide ballot measures that were before voters this cycle. 2 of those passed. That was the impeachment of statewide elected officials by a 2/3 vote of the chamber, as well as pieces around a labor peace agreement for cannabis workers. There were 3 measures that did not pass. One of those would create a compensation commission to determine the salaries. Another would have ranked choice voting. And then finally, the one that I think got really the most attention statewide was around this 3% tax on corporation sales above 25 million. And then that money would go out to equally amongst all Oregonians. So those 3 measures did not pass. Next slide. So really, what does this all mean? And it's not the most eloquent thing to say, but it's really more of the same, which is to say that when you take a look at what happened at the national level, you take a look at what happened here at the local level, I think there are a lot of significant changes. At the statewide level, I would say that is not the case, that we are seeing a pretty steady, very stable, very much what we have seen the last couple of cycles is what we have in our Oregon House, our Oregon Senate, and at the statewide level. And really, if you take a look at it, like some of the more significant ballot measures that really would have changed, you know, whether that was Measure 118 with the corporation sales tax, ranked choice voting, that salary commission that would have maybe finally raised the salaries of statewide elected officials and others. Those 3 kind of sweeping ballot measures did not change. When you take a look at the national level where we saw, you know, a red wave really come in, more Republicans both in the Congress as well as the president, we did not see that same change, kind of sweeping red wave. In fact, if anything, Oregon went a little bit bluer, picking up that final Senate seat in Bend. So really, I think what we'll see is very much more of the same. I think what we have seen the past couple of sessions in terms of tone and tenor, in terms of leadership, I think is what we're going to continue to see as a result of this election. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn now to Council's state legislative agenda. As you are aware, it is composed of really 2 documents. The first is that are your legislative principles, and those really are those overarching evergreen principles that help guide myself and others down in Salem when we are advocating for Metro. And then the second are your legislative priorities. Those are meant to be more session specific. They are really meant to call out what are your top priorities down in Salem and what we anticipate at this moment in time we will be spending the bulk of our time down in Salem for you. Next slide. This year we did I would call it a substantial update to your legislative principles. We presented these last time to you and really walked through some of those streamlinings, tweaks, and fixes. We added some additional principles. We took out some principles. And then based on the feedback that you gave us at the last session, we have made some additional small, again, tweaks and fixes. Some of that has to do with word choice, where we're calling out more clearly council's commitment to things like workforce and affordable housing, climate, those types of things, which you can call them word choices, but I think of them as very like critical call outs of what council's priorities are. We also added some principles around cultural and economic vitality, as well as adding back in some of the principles around annexation in our land use section. So things like that. The draft that is currently in your packet is a pretty finalized draft. So I would say, you know, if you have any changes that you'd like to see to those legislative principles, please let me know pretty soon here, since it's going to be before you at the mid to end of December for adoption. Next slide. So moving on to your legislative priorities, there were a number of priorities that I have listed above here that I'm not going to read out. These were the priorities that we discussed in October. So they are a part of your legislative priority draft, but I am actually going to spend the bulk of today's presentation on the additions. Next slide, please. So the first of those additions has to do with Metro annexation. So I believe you are well aware that this is a little bit of an in the weeds issue, but that Metro's UGB and its service district boundary are not coterminous. There are places where there is land that is inside our UGB, but it's not inside our district boundary. This is why you have Glenn before you with some frequency to talk about annexation. We are looking at efforts to really streamline that process, and in particular are targeting some of the lots that are not yet inside city boundaries but are inside our UGB, and really trying to combine those efforts that landowners have when they are being annexed into a city to also be automatically annexed into Metro Service District. Next slide. The next priority that we would like to add or are offering to add to your legislative priorities has to do with recreational immunity. So recreational immunity is a long-standing state statute that essentially offers decreased liability to folks who, public and private, who allow people to recreate on their land free of charge. There was a court case in 2023 that really gutted this statute. And so there were efforts in 2024 to address that, and there will continue to be efforts in 2025 to also address that. Next slide. The transportation package is the next priority we are proposing to add to your legislative agenda. As I think you all are aware, there's a possibility of a state 2025 transportation package. We have been working over the course of the last year with JPAC to develop a set of regional priorities so that we can arrive down in Salem arm in arm. We've also had a couple of numerous conversations with you all about those priorities as well, really trying to mirror the JPAC priority setting process, so that again, we are arriving in Salem with the same set of priorities. So this is the priority that would call out the JPAC priorities, which look at short-term funding solutions, long-term funding solutions, finishing what we started, safe urban arterials and streets, transit investments, and resiliency. Next slide. This priority is particularly timely since you just had our colleagues in WPES before you to talk about food waste. There are partners statewide that are very interested in bringing a similar program that we have in our region to the rest of the state. And so there are folks that are working on a statewide program that would address food waste. In addition to that, there are also additional partners that are interested in tackling what we call date labeling. So I think you are aware when you look at products that you buy, they have often things that say use by, sell by, best by. Those terms are entirely unregulated, or nearly entirely unregulated. And so there are states that have stepped in to regulate that. So there are folks that are interested in addressing what those terms could really mean, and in an effort to ensure that folks aren't throwing away food that is edible and can be used. Next slide. So an additional priority we are proposing adding to your legislative agenda really is around the Recycling Modernization Act. So there are efforts we believe coming in this session that would really try to delay and dilute the Recycling Modernization Act. And just as a reminder, this was the landmark 2021 legislation that really modernized our recycling system and created the very first paper, plastic and packaging EPR program. And so there are folks who are working to strip out some of the core tenets of it and also to delay the start date of it, which is set to be started at the middle of 2025. Next slide. So moving on, that wraps up the list of your draft legislative priorities for your consideration. And I, want to end on a happy note, which is your legislative breakfast. This was a massive success last year. It was the first time that we had, well, I've been corrected. We have done it once before a while ago, but it's the first time in a long time that we had done a legislative breakfast last year. And we are proposing bringing it back on January 7th, just a couple of weeks or two before the start of session, again at the Oregon Zoo. That was quite the hit. So I will be in touch with all of you with more details around that, but hope you all can join us. And last slide, please. With that, I'm here to answer any questions.
Counselors, any questions? Annalisa, we've been talking a lot about with representatives over the last, 6 to 9 months about possible transportation planning projects. And I just wanted to maybe use this opportunity to update the council on what we've been talking about. We've had a conversation with Representative Mannix about rail connections between the Portland region and Salem. They were very interested in looking at WES, and I think what we convinced them to do is look at a wider range of ways to get that access, whether that would be extension of light rail or Amtrak, based on our experience with WES in this region. But I think that's it. While not a priority, we'll see how he does moving forward with that. And I think council, if you're interested, just in making sure that we know where all of that is in the process, because it could actually allow us to, if we could get some momentum, find money for Barber, moving that back onto the agenda again. So that's one. The second one was the high-speed rail planning, for knowing what we want to do, starting that conversation with our community as Washington State moves forward, with the hope that we still have a high-speed rail program at the federal administration level moving forward. And then there was a third one.
The regional rail study
Oh, that we're still working on.
that we're still
with-
working on, so it's not.
with Senator Gorsuch.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those were three, and I guess my addition to that in my head is we probably need to have a conversation about whether we also ask for any planning money through the transportation package for our future vision. So talk about that later, but I think we should probably figure out if there's an ask there. Because we also haven't thought about how to ask at the federal level. Other regions have gotten EPA grants. So, okay, let's just, assuming there's an EPA again, moving forward. Questions? Counselor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Annalise. Again, always responsive to the things that we want to see reflected coming out of the legislative session. One thing I've been really, you brought this to us a couple of times now, and I've been just mulling over that last section on cultural and economic vitality. And I was wondering if it would be possible to add one more bullet there around workforce, because there's a number, workforce and specifically economic development activities that are happening right now that we are a part of as an agency with GPI, Work Systems, Port of Portland. And I think it would be really good to spell it out and close the loop so we can all understand that cross jurisdictional initiatives are happening and we need to support that, especially if we're talking about housing and things like that, folks need to be able to pay for that. And so part of that is they need jobs, and we are really, really focused on how do we bring well-paying jobs, family jobs here to the region, but also increase the industrial readiness for more industries to come in and support the diverse working types that we have across the region that can support the people here. So I would offer to ask if that's okay with the rest of the council, if we could add one more bullet there.
Awesome. Seeing no issues with that request, can add that in. All right, thank
Yes.
you. Counselor Wong.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for bringing this forward. I think it's really comprehensive. Let's see, I think two things that have been kind of on my mind are whether there might be any specific actions or investments to continue on the Downtown Portland Task Force. And hopefully, we would support continued investment in that. And I also kind of in the land use and housing section, I didn't see kind of a bucket for supporting infrastructure investment to make housing production more possible. So maybe that could be in the principles as well. And I was actually just wondering what your take might be on, what kind of specific housing actions the state legislature may consider this upcoming session? If there's any kind of new thinking around that?
It's a good question. I think that we will continue to see housing and homelessness to be one of the top priorities of the state in this upcoming session. A lot of the investments in housing are really their investments, and it's about funding. And I think what we are hearing is that early indications are that it is going to be a very tight budget for the state this year. And so, folks are talking about 5 to 10% budget cuts across the board for all agencies. Typically when those types of things happen, the top priorities of the state can be held harmless or not cut quite as much. And so I do think that we will see a continued focus on substantial investment in housing and homeless services from the state. But I think, so much depends on what that revenue forecast really looks like. And then, I think we will continue to see an emphasis on housing production and additional, I don't want to use the word tweaks because it sounds so small, but I think there were both small and large tweaks to try to spur additional production. I think at this point, we are not anticipating large scale UGB legislation vis-a-vis housing production or industrial land. I think the past couple sessions have been pretty significant on that front, and the initial what we're hearing initially from legislators is very much like we want to see how those play out before we dive back in. But I do think you will continue to see some other substantial changes to, I would say, our land use system, meaning the big word for land use, not just UGB land use.
And, as we're working to create kind of a more regional approach to housing and homelessness in our region, how do state legislators think about that? Do they think about it in just their district, or are they looking for more coordination and alignments regionally or perhaps statewide? I don't know, where do they?
Actually, you're kind of hitting the nail on the head of this idea around cross systems alignment, whether that is, between housing, homelessness, behavioral health, also between, geographically, how are we aligning systems? There is, I think, a strong emphasis going into the session to really focus on that across, how are we de-siloing? You'll see that called out, and in fact, one of our priorities, because we know it's going to be a really rich topic. A couple of sessions back, there was an effort to really to have some pilots similar to the joint office, so that collaboration between counties and cities. So looking more at a regional level and other parts throughout the state around housing and homelessness. I'm not aware of the outcome of those pilots, but my understanding is there is a growing really a growing understanding of the regionalism of housing, and that communities need to really work together. And that is the ethos that's coming into the state, but also they are statewide. So, thinking about it as a whole state as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Seeing no other hands raised, I think those two additions are helpful additions, and we look forward to seeing that in December.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right, counselors, we have our council chief of staff sitting in for our COO. Kristen is here today. I don't know if you had any preordained communications.
I do not.
Okay, welcome. Thank you. With that, counselors, do you have any communications? Counselor Gonzalez.
Thanks, President Peterson. Yeah, I have a few things. This weekend, Bienestar hosted a housing forum in all Spanish with residents in Washington County, and I just wanted to share some takeaways I had from that conversation. Obviously, post-election, kind of reflecting through the implications of the next administration on so many communities. It was just, there's a lot of energy around that, but also a really clear call to action to Metro on housing affordability, workforce housing, pathways to homeownership. I mean, people just asking, what can Metro do to do this? So I shared a little bit about some of the work that we're doing potentially around, funding. We're celebrating the success of the housing bond and the projects that we've been able to build throughout the region. But I don't know, that just felt like a really great, clear message takeaway. And I wanted to share that with you, that our communities, despite everything that is happening, they want us to deliver on that. Also, last Thursday, I was able to present to the regional traffic class. So I want to just thank Councilor Simpson for leading the council and creating an ownership investment in that. Just kind of spending time with that group of folks was really just created a lot of hope for the vision and thinking through the future vision process and all those things that we're working on. And lastly, just a reminder to the council that this next Thursday, we will have a resolution to honor the legacy of Bob Salinger. We've been able to work with Parks and Nature to send out a lot of invitations to key folks. And we have quite an amazing set of people that will be here to testify on his behalf. We also heard from Bob's wife as well, and she plans to be here. So I think that's really special that hopefully we can create a space of community. I think it's just thinking through some of the logistics of that, and hope that y'all kind of come in the right spirit on Thursday. I know you will. And if there are any ideas around other things that we could do to make the space the right space, let's make sure we chat about that. Thanks. That's all.
Thank you, Counselor, and thank you for organizing that. Counselor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam President. Just reporting back, yesterday was Veterans Day, so happy Veterans Day, or late Veterans Day to all my fellow service members. I had an opportunity to represent Metro in the Veterans Day parade yesterday down MLK. It was a fun event. Had a lot of speakers, a lot of community came out to show up and for our veterans here. Lots of great messages, but I think the biggest message was one of strength and hope, and that this is our region and our community, and we are stronger together. So just want to say that. Thank you.
Awesome, and thank you for your service.
Oh yeah, forgot about that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, I have to highlight everybody else.
Yeah.
I forget about myself.
Service before self.
That's one of the Air Force Corps tenets. Service before self.
Counselors, anything else for the good of the order? All right, with that, we are adjourned. See you back here Thursday.
Mm. That was a quick one. It was a quick one.